Hey, how's it going, everybody? It's Mr. White here with your supply and demand test review for K-Level. So what you're going to want to do is get out that fancy blue test review that you hopefully got in class. If not, you can just watch the video. You really don't need the blue test review. Follow along with me as we go over the answers. Okay. So the very first thing it wants to know is a little bit of vocabulary. This is easy stuff, right? First thing is demand. Remember that demand just simply means the amount of a good or service that people are willing and able to buy at all possible prices in the market. Hopefully you remember that the law of demand causes a downward sloping demand curve. So remember that demand down to the sand should be a downward sloping curve for demand. Next up, ceteris paribus. That's the thing that sounds like a Harry Potter wizard spell or something. But remember, ceteris paribus simply means all other things remain constant. Whenever we draw supply and demand curves, there are lots of different factors that could affect supply or demand of a product. But there's no way we could possibly account for all of those factors when we're trying to figure out one of these supply and demand curves. So we just say ceteris paribus, which means if this one thing changes and everything else stays the same, then this is what we think will happen. Next up, elastic versus inelastic. Hopefully you remember that rubber bands are elastic, so they're flexible. So when we talk about elasticity of supply or demand, what we're really talking about is how flexible can producers or consumers be if the price changes. So elasticity tells us how much the quantity demanded or the quantity supplied will respond to a change in the price of a good or a service. So if something is said to have elastic demand or elastic supply, that means that consumers or producers could be flexible if the price changes. That means that a small change in price for something with elastic demand or elastic supply is going to cause a proportionally much larger change in quantity demanded or quantity supplied. Now, inelastic means that consumers and producers really cannot be flexible if the price changes. That means a large change in price will probably just result in a very small change in quantity demanded or quantity supplied. A little bit more vocabulary for us here. So the next word is supply. Pretty basic. It's kind of like demand. Supply means the amount of a good or a service that producers are willing and able to provide at all possible prices in the market. Now, equilibrium is that magical spot when we put our supply and demand curves together where the two curves intersect. Equilibrium is defined as the price where our quantity demanded and our quantity supplied are equal. Now, next up is surplus. Now, surplus is any price that would cause our quantity demanded and quantity supplied to be mismatched. Surpluses are defined by quantity supplied being greater than quantity demanded. That's why they put Halloween candy on sale the day after Halloween, because the supply of Halloween candy at the store was too high, and so the only way they can get rid of it is to lower the price. That'll increase more demand. Now, the opposite of a surplus is a shortage. A shortage is another mismatch between supply and demand. That's a price that would cause the quantity demanded to exceed the quantity supplied. So our quantity demanded is greater than our quantity supplied. A great example is what happens every year on Black Friday. On Black Friday, they put the prices of goods and services really, really low, much, much lower than the equilibrium price. That stimulates a lot of demand, but unfortunately the suppliers don't want to provide very many of those goods and services at such a low price because they lose profit. Now, price ceiling. A price ceiling is when the government steps into a market and they impose a maximum price for that good or service. The whole purpose of a price ceiling, the reason why the government would institute a price ceiling, is because they want to lower the price. They want to keep it low enough that consumers can afford it. So the purpose of a price ceiling is to help consumers. A great example of this would be rent-controlled housing in big cities like New York, where the average cost of an apartment is too high for most people to afford. So the government will step in and create a price ceiling to keep the price artificially low. Now, of course, we know the bad thing about a price ceiling, the unintended consequence, or I guess you could say the opportunity cost of a price ceiling, is that you're probably going to create a shortage. Now, the opposite of a price ceiling is a price floor. Hopefully you remember that a price floor is another kind of government-imposed price, but a price floor is the lowest price that can be charged for a good or a service. The purpose of a price floor is to protect the producers of goods and services. So when you're out trying to produce labor, when you're supplying your labor, the government actually institutes a price floor on how much you can charge for your labor. The point of that is to protect you, the producer of labor. And so the price floor that we have for labor in this country is called minimum wage. That's the lowest that you're allowed to charge for your labor. I'm sure it's much higher than the equilibrium, because I think if McDonald's could get away with paying like $2 an hour, they probably would. All right, so now let's talk about demand. Hopefully you remember the law of demand. It's very, very important. The law of demand tells us that when prices increase, the quantity demanded decreases. And when prices decrease, the quantity demand increases. That means that there is an inverse relationship between quantity demanded and price. That's why we have a downward sloping demand curve. Remember, demand down to the sand. Now, if the price changes, all we have to do is shift from one point to another along our initial demand curve. But if something other than the price changes, some outside factor, that's when we have to shift our entire demand curve either left or right. Hopefully you remember we say if price changes, just move. But if something other than price changes, oh well, shift happens, right? So when we shift our demand, there are 5 different outside factors that can cause that to happen. And the way we can remember those 5 outside factors is by saying, I demand the brand. Now, the B in brand stands for buyer expectations. Buyer expectations has to do with availability and price that buyers expect in the future. So if buyers expect something to be sold out tomorrow, they're going to rush out to buy it today. Or if buyers expect that something's going to be more expensive tomorrow, they're going to rush out to buy it today. Those things would cause demand to increase. However, if buyers think that something is going to be easier to get tomorrow, or if they think it's going to be cheaper tomorrow, then they will reduce their demand for that product today, and the demand would decrease. The next up is related goods. Hopefully you remember related goods means products that could either be purchased together or one product that could be purchased in place of another. Now, if we're talking about one product that could be purchased in place of another, that's what we would call a substitute. A great example of a substitute could be 2 different gas stations. If Shell has their gas at 225, but Exxon has their gas at 224, you're probably going to substitute Exxon gas for Shell gas. Now, the other thing is a complement. Complements are 2 products that are usually purchased together, like, for example, peanut butter and jelly. If there's a sale going on for jelly, we're probably going to demand more peanut butter, even if the price of peanut butter hasn't changed. Now, next up is annual income. That's a pretty simple one. Generally, if people's income goes up, they demand more goods and services. If people's income goes down, they're going to demand fewer goods and services. So increasing income would shift our demand curve to the right, but lowering people's income would shift the demand curve to the left. Now, the next up is number of buyers, the number of buyers. That means how many customers are available to buy the product. So if more people move into a place, demand for goods and services will rise. If people move out of a place, demand for goods and services will fall. I think the example we talked about was the Super Bowl coming to Houston. When the Super Bowl came to Houston, demand for everything in Houston was higher. You know, demand for restaurants, demand for Ubers, demand for hotel rooms. But as soon as all those visitors left when the Super Bowl was over, demand for all those things fell. Demand for Ubers fell, demand for restaurants fell, demand for hotels fell. Last up is desires and tastes. Of course, we know that means that when things are cool or popular, people will demand more of them regardless of how much they cost. But if things are not cool or not popular, it doesn't matter how cheap you make it, people won't buy it. Pretty basic. I don't know if we need to get into examples of that because I think all of you know what it means when something is popular. Now, when it comes to the elasticity of demand, there are 3 factors that can tell us whether a product would have elastic or inelastic demand. So let's talk about them. The first has to do with whether the product is a need or a want. Generally, if it's a need, it's going to have inelastic demand. Like, for example, medicine. You probably don't want medicine, but you need it. So even if the price of medicine goes up, you're still going to demand medicine. Now, if something is a want, like a Louis Vuitton purse, you're probably not going to buy it if the price goes up. As a matter of fact, you can be flexible about buying a Louis Vuitton purse. You can't be very flexible about buying medicine. Now, next up, are there substitutes available? If there are no substitutes available, like that anti-parasitic drug Daraprim that came out a couple years ago, and the company that bought it jacked up the price by they jacked up the price by 5,000%. The price per pill was $13. They jacked it up to $750 a pill. You might wonder, why would they do that? You would think that would drive away customers. But the thing is, there's no substitute for Daraprim. It's the only drug out there that can save your life if you have a compromised immune system like HIV and you get a parasitic infection like malaria. So it's kind of like pay the price or die. In that situation, we can't be flexible. But if it's something that has lots of substitutes, the demand is more likely to be elastic. When it comes to Louis Vuitton purses, there are so many other options. You don't have to have a Louis Vuitton purse. Maybe you want one, but you don't have to have one. There are plenty of substitutes. You could go get a cheap purse from Walmart. You could use a plastic bag. You could use a backpack, right? You don't have to have a Louis Vuitton purse. So last up, is it expensive or inexpensive? Generally, expensive things have more inelastic demand. That's not always true, but generally it's true. And if it's inexpensive, if it's something cheap, then generally your demand is more elastic. Okay? Now, it's important to remember the shape of elastic and inelastic demand curves. That's going to have special significance for your short answer question. So, elastic demand tends to look more like a flat horizontal curve. So, if you can imagine, like, here's your price and here's your quantity, elastic demand looks like this, where it's almost flat. Now, inelastic demand tends to look more steep. It's gonna, I don't know if I can make this work. Okay, it's gonna be more vertical, almost straight up and down. That just shows that when the price changes, there won't be much change to quantity demanded. So please remember the shape of elastic versus inelastic demand. Okay, let's talk now about supply. The law of supply tells us that when prices increase, the quantity supplied will also increase. And if prices decrease, the quantity supplied will also decrease. This means that there is a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. Now, just like with demand, if the price changes, all we need to do is shift from one point to another along, I said shift. I shouldn't say shift, my bad. If the price changes, we just move from one point to another along our supply curve. But if something other than the price changes, what do we say? Yeah, shift happens, right? Shift happens. So, the things that could cause our supply curve to shift, the way we can remember them is by saying suppliers provide. Suppliers provide. So the P in provide stands for producer expectations. Just like buyers, producers are always trying to expect what's going to come next. So they're thinking about how much can we sell this thing for tomorrow, or how many people might want to buy this thing tomorrow. If businesses think that they can sell a product for more tomorrow, or if they think the demand for a product is going to be higher tomorrow, they'll produce more of it right now. However, if they think that the prices are going to go down tomorrow, or if they think that people won't demand the product tomorrow, they're going to reduce their supply. They're going to cut back on producing that product. Now, next up is regulations. Regulations just means rules that businesses are required to follow by the government. Generally, complying with more rules makes it harder to produce goods and services, and so therefore, more rules, less production. Next up, other sellers. That just means how many companies are actually producing that good or service. If more companies start producing a good or service, the supply of the good or service increases. But if fewer companies produce a good or a service, the supply will decrease. Okay, pretty simple. Various taxes. That means that businesses have to pay all kinds of taxes. If the government increases taxes on businesses, they can't use that money to produce things, and therefore supply will fall. But if the government cuts taxes, the businesses can use more of their money to produce, and so therefore supply would increase. Now next up, inputs. Inputs means all of the resources or different supplies that you would need to create a good or a service. If the cost of your resources and your supplies increases, or if resources and supplies become harder to get, the supply is going to fall. But if your resources become cheaper, or if they become more abundant, then your supply should increase. Next up is different or new technology. Generally, having better technology, better tools, better equipment makes it much easier to produce things. And so when we get better technology, production should increase. Now, last off, environment. That doesn't just mean nature. Environment just means any other outside events that can make it either easier or harder to produce goods and services. For example, when Hurricane Harvey hit Texas, it made it much harder for us to produce goods and services, so the supply of services went down. However, other things, like for example, a really good growing season for corn, that would increase the supply of corn. So any kind of outside factor, whether it be something that's man-made like a war, or whether it be something that's from nature like a good growing season, all of those things could affect our supply. All right, now, just like how there's price elasticity of demand, we also have price elasticity of supply. Remember that elasticity means how responsive can we be if there's a change in price. So there's three factors that tell producers how responsive they can be. The first one is the availability of resources to produce their product. If the resources are hard to obtain, then the supply of that product is likely to be inelastic. However, if the resources are abundant and easy to obtain, the supply is more likely to be elastic. How long would it take to produce that thing? If the good or service takes a really long time to produce, that means that producers cannot respond when the price changes, and so the supply is going to be inelastic. But if it's something that can be produced relatively quickly, the supply is going to be more elastic. Last off, how much skill does it take to make that good or service? If it's going to take some really highly skilled workers, then the product will be inelastic. But if it can be produced by unskilled workers, then the product's more likely to be elastic. So, just like with demand, if we're looking at an elastic supply curve, it's going to be more flat. It's going to look more like a horizontal supply curve. Whereas if we're looking at an inelastic supply curve, it's going to appear to be more vertical, almost straight up and down. So please remember what elastic and inelastic supply curves look like. Once again, that's going to be important for your short answer question. All right, so if you flip over on the back side of your blue sheet, you've got these different graphs, and I want you to match them to say whether it's an increase of demand or an increase of supply, or whether it's a price ceiling or a price floor. Decrease of demand, decrease of supply. You get the idea. Okay, so let's start off with an increase of demand. When demand increases, the demand curve will shift to the right. Please remember that a rightward shift is always considered an increase. And also remember that our supply and demand curves can never, ever, ever move up or down. They don't move up or down. They only move to the left or to the right. That's it. Okay? So a rightward shift is an increase. Increases of demand will cause a couple things to happen. It's going to cause our equilibrium price to increase, but it's also going to cause our equilibrium quantity to increase. Okay? This is because of the fact that when there's more demand, sellers have to raise their price in order to stimulate more supply. If they didn't raise the price, it would lead to a shortage. All right, next up, a decrease of demand. Since we said a rightward shift is always an increase, that means a leftward shift is always a decrease. So this is what it looks like when demand decreases. It's going to shift to the left. You'll notice that when it shifts to the left, we've created a new equilibrium. This new equilibrium is going to cause the equilibrium price to decrease, and the equilibrium quantity is going to decrease too. This just means that people don't want to buy the product, so the sellers will have to lower their price in order to return to equilibrium. Otherwise, the sellers would end up with a surplus of their product. Next up, increase of supply. Now, when supply increases, once again, it's going to be a rightward shift. So an increase of supply looks just like this. You see how our supply curve shifted to the right. This is not up or down, it's only left or right. Remember that. So when our supply curve shifts to the right, a new equilibrium is created. This time, the price is going to go down and the quantity is going to go up. It's kind of like the best of both worlds. That means we're going to have more of this product and it's going to be cheaper than before. So the equilibrium price decreases and the equilibrium quantity increases. Pretty cool situation here. Now, a decrease of supply. We said that shifting to the left is always a decrease. I know when we shift our supply curve to the left, it kind of looks like the new supply curve is above the old supply curve. But remember, these things never ever move up and down. They only move left and right. So when we shift our supply curve to the left like you've just seen, this is considered a decrease of supply. Once again, we're going to create a new equilibrium. Now, our equilibrium price has increased and our equilibrium quantity has decreased. This is kind of like the worst possible thing that can happen. It's going to be harder to get this product and it's going to be more expensive than before. Now, let's talk about a shortage or a price ceiling. Now, a shortage does not have to be caused by a price ceiling. A shortage could just be caused by lowering a price, like on Black Friday. When businesses lower their price below normal, it causes shortages. However, sometimes the government will force businesses to lower their price below normal, and that's when we call it a price ceiling. Now, remember that when we draw our price ceiling, it should always make like a little house. So you see, here's my house. Like, here's my front door. Woohoo! Here's one of our windows. Okay, I don't know if this is going to look good. We're going to try to make it look good. Okay, there's a window. All right, there's a window. Oh, what a beautiful little house. Oh, my goodness, I want to move in right now. Okay, see how we got this beautiful little house? If you can make your graph look like a house, then you'll know that you drew the price ceiling correctly. If your house is upside down like a hurricane blew it over, you know there's a big problem there. Okay? Now, the problem with lowering the price below equilibrium is that it creates a disequilibrium. Hopefully you remember that disequilibrium is any price below our equilibrium price. This is going to result in a shortage because our quantity demanded is greater than our quantity supplied. All right, now, a price floor is the exact opposite of a price ceiling, okay? So when the government wants to keep the price higher than normal, they'll institute a price floor. Or if a business just rose their price up way above the normal price, it's going to create something called a surplus, okay? So at a higher than normal price, what we're going to expect to see is another kind of disequilibrium. Above our price equilibrium, we're going to create a surplus. Now, I don't have any cute little drawing you can do on this one. Just make sure that you know that the floor must always go above equilibrium and the ceiling must always go below equilibrium. I know that that kind of hurts your brain because you think ceilings are up and floors are down, but on our supply and demand graph, it's the exact opposite. All right, now, it's got one more little practice thing for supply and demand. It wants to know, like, if supply increases, what happens to quantity demand? If supply decreases, what happens to quantity demand, etc. So let's just go through those real quick, okay? If we had an increase in supply, that means a rightward shift of our supply curve. Remember, we saw the supply curve shifted to the right. This will cause our quantity demanded to increase, okay? The reason why that's going to happen is because, remember, when we have a rightward shift of our supply curve, the price falls. And we know that when price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. Now, next up, a decrease in supply. That means a leftward shift of our supply curve, like we just saw a moment ago. That's going to result in a decrease in our quantity demanded, because when our supply curve shifts to the left, the price will increase. When the price increases, fewer people are going to want to buy it, and so the quantity demanded will decrease. Last thing I want to know, an increase in demand. Well, that's a rightward shift of our demand curve. That's going to result in an increase in our quantity supplied. Okay, just imagine that demand curve shifting to the right. When the demand curve shifts to the right, the price increases. And so we know that when price goes up, quantity supplied also goes up. Remember, that's part of the law of supply. So these parts should be pretty easy. Just make sure that you're very comfortable with what happens to quantity supplied or quantity demanded if either supply or demand increases. All right. Now, just in case you forgot, I threw this in last minute, right? Remember, rightward shifts are always, always, and forever an increase. Leftward shifts are always, always, and forever a decrease. All right, one last little hurdle that you got to get over. And guys, you really, really need to go ahead and just try to do this tonight. Make it part of your studying. Answer the short answer question. Guys, I'm giving it to you ahead of time. You've got so much time to try it out and check it and make sure it's right. Heck, if you show it to me, I'll even tell you if you're on the right track. But if you just wait until you come in on the day of the test and just try to see what happens, well, then I guess that you're just going to have to face the consequences if it doesn't work out. So, this is your short answer question. You need to draw a correctly labeled model of the market for gasoline. So you need to put a title at the top of your model and write gasoline so we know what it's the supply and demand of. Then you're going to assume that the supply of gasoline is elastic, because in real life the supply of gasoline is elastic. So think about how you should draw your gasoline supply curve to make it elastic. Now, you're going to set the market equilibrium price at $2. and the equilibrium quantity at 10,000 gallons. Then you're going to explain the following. First of all, is the demand for gas likely to be elastic or inelastic? Okay, think about that for a second. Think about all those factors that determine the elasticity of demand. Is gas something we can be flexible about buying, or is it something that we can't be flexible about buying? Once you figured that out, I need you to explain to me why, and then draw your demand curve to properly reflect the elasticity of demand. Okay? So if it's elastic, make it look elastic. If it's inelastic, please make it look inelastic. Next up, what would happen if the government imposed a price ceiling on gasoline at a price of $1.75 per gallon? Hopefully you've noticed that that's below the equilibrium price. That's where price ceilings are supposed to live, right? Below equilibrium. So make sure that your price ceiling goes below equilibrium. If you put it above equilibrium, you're not doing it correctly. Okay? You're going to correctly label your price ceiling, and you're also going to correctly label any resulting surpluses or shortages that might occur. Now, the last thing you're going to need to do is tell me if gasoline companies believe that the gas prices are likely to rise in the near future, how would that affect our graph of supply and demand for gasoline? Is that going to cause a shift? Is it going to change the price? What's going to happen? The price hasn't gone up yet, but the producers expect that the price is going to go up. Okay? So correctly label what happens on your graph. That's all you need to do. Once you've done that, my God, you are ready to get an A on this test. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Otherwise, good luck on your test, guys.